Hello, America. I'm Mark Levin. This is Life, Liberty, and Levin. I have a great guest. Victor Davis Hanson, how are you?
Very good, Mark. Thanks for having me.
It's a great pleasure. As far as I'm concerned, you're one of the leading intellectuals in this country. You write beautifully. You have a regular column. Your books are great. October of last year, you wrote this book, The Second World Wars, A History of World War II. You have a brand new book coming out in March, The Case for Trump. Yeah. That should be interesting, by Basic Books in March. You're a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford. You're a professor at California State University. You're a distinguished fellow at Hillsdale College. You've taught at the U.S. Naval Academy. You've taught at Pepperdine University Graduate School. What haven't you done? My Lord, that's interesting. But you know what strikes me about you? You were one of the first intellectuals to support Donald Trump in your writings. I mean, it was gradual, but then why was that?
Well, I think all of us felt that the national ticket was playing by the Marquess of Queensberry rules. We really hadn't seen a vigorous pushback. Remember Lee Atwater in the '88 campaign? We kind of deplored his tactics post factum, but at the time he took apart Dukakis, the contradictions. And so we were losing with Bob Dole and McCain and Romney, 46, 47, 43, even as we were doing well on the conservative side at the local. 1,000 offices lost during the Obama administration. So Trump seemed to be the only one that was unconcerned what the establishment, and by that I don't want to be vague, what university professors said, New York Times said, PBS, NPR, Council on Foreign Relations. He just spoke to the people, and he did it in such a way that was refreshing, and he sort of was psychodramatic that this was an existential war and we were losing it, and we had to fight back and not be worried what people said. And then the other thing was really strange about him, Mark, was he didn't buy into the new demography. It may be true, but he said, you know, you can win by losing California and New York and Illinois, because there are 6 to 8 million people, Wisconsin, North Carolina, Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, that either didn't vote Republican or they didn't vote at all. And I can win them back with a nationalist, strong jobs, I like the deplorable message. And people thought that was crazy. And so I thought he was just eccentric, and I was a little bit dangerous, I thought, but I thought that he was, at this point, we're at a point of no return, and he was the anecdote.
We're at a point of no return. You said existential threat.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, if say we're the typical of conservative America, you and I, the 65 million that voted for Trump, we look around, it's like a synopticon. We've got the NFL, NBA, Silicon Valley, Apple, Google, Facebook. We've got Rockefeller. We've got the Brookings Institution. We have cable TV, not just MSNBC and CNN, but the major networks as well. We have NPR. We have PBS. We have the progressive cultural movement.
Academia.
Music. Academia is where I am. And we're surrounded, and we think that these institutions don't have as much clout as they do have. And then we get shocked every 4 years that the message just surrounds us, and we don't have a mechanism for breaking through to the American people and getting a message. And the irony is the message of free market capitalism, limited government, individual liberty is what they thrive for. In their daily lives, they sometimes vote against their interests because this circular octopus, synopticon, whatever you want to call it, we don't get any, you and I, conservatives, traditionalists, we have safe spaces, if I could use their word, where we retreat to. For them, it's a 24/7 relentless entertainment, education, politics, media, and it's overwhelming.
Do you think, the progressives, they wrote about this, that they basically needed to devour society, all these major institutions. Do you think they've largely succeeded?
I do. I think if you, tomorrow, Mark Levin, go to Stanford and you give a lecture on global warming, I don't think you're going to be able to finish that lecture without being interrupted. I think if I go to Stanford or Harvard, Yale, and give a lecture on the value of assimilation, integration, and intermarriage with measured, legal, meritocratic, diverse immigration, I won't be able to finish that lecture. I think if I touch somebody in the shoulder and that person files a sexual harassment suit at me at a major corporation, I'm not going to be given due process. And that's besides the social chaos that we live in. I live in an area that's ground zero of illegal immigration, where the Norteños gang is fighting the M13 gang across the street. I'm talking about refined society. So I don't think due process, free speech, the right redress of grievances exist in major areas of American life: corporate, university, foundational life, media.
So you're saying what you've already seen, and I agree with you, the fundamental transformation of America gradually. Is it picking up speed now?
I think it is. I don't want to be pessimistic in the sense that I really admire you, and I admire people at Fox News, I admire people, some in the Republican Party, really brave voices there are in academia that are saying, you know, I'm going to speak out regardless of the consequences. But the Romans and the Greeks believed that luxus, that's what more authors use, luxury, affluence, leads to non-seriousness. I don't want to use the word decadence, but we are such an affluent, leisured society. So somebody from the inner city can have an iPhone with more computing power than 6 IBM mainframes. A guy across the street can come from Mexico and he can be in a Kia, and that can be a better ride than a Mercedes 30 years ago. And I think that's great, but what we don't get with it is some collective gratitude or some sense of accomplishment. Instead, we get, that Kia is not as good as today's Lexus, and therefore the equality result didn't work for me. And that, I don't like the lack of gratitude or the trashing of the system or our ancestors that gave us all this system. And maybe it's the universities have created an arrogant and ignorant cadre of youth, but something's gone wrong.
Isn't this the issue about freedom generally? Freedom is a tremendous thing.
Yeah.
But it also gives opportunity for very evil people to use freedom to destroy freedom.
Yeah.
And isn't that what the framers of the Constitution tried to prevent? They were worried about mobocracy. They were worried about autocracy. And so they create this republic. And there's a constant attack at the foundational principles of the republic. President wins the Electoral College. They want to get rid of the Electoral College. The progressives don't like the fact that the Senate is representative of the state, so they get rid of that, and you have direct election of the senators. They want to get rid of other aspects, separation of powers. They keep building up this fourth branch, this administrative branch of government with 2 million people and growing. That's what they do. It isn't that an attack on our foundational principles, liberty?
Yeah, I think it is. I think they understand what the framers were up to. And their model is not a constitutional Rome that went through Europe through the Enlightenment with Montesquieu separated. It's radical Athenian democracy. On any given day, 51% of the population decide what the law is. There is no constitutional protection. You want to kill Socrates on Monday or murder the Melians on Tuesday, you can do it if you have 51%. So it's been steady. I mean, we went from property qualifications, moderate property, to direct election of senators, and there were some arguments for this. And then, as you say, now it's abolishing the Electoral College and enlarging the Supreme Court now, packing it, enlarging the House of Representatives, maybe 1,000 members. Why people in California say, why does Wyoming get 250,000 people get one senator and we 20 million get one? That's not fair. Let's turn the Senate into the House. But the long-term trajectory is government-mandated or sanctioned equality of result. Because they got what they wanted with the civil rights, finally. We had true equality of opportunity. And then they were expecting that everybody would be equal. And human nature being what it is, it's never going to be that way. So they said, the conservative position is we're not going to be equal, but the poorest person is going to have a pretty good life if he's in a free market economy and a constitutional system. But they say, no, we don't really care what absolute poverty or wealth is. We want everybody to be equal. They would rather have everybody making $20,000 a year than the poor making 50 and somebody making $1 billion. So that's relentless. That's a psychological...
That is a very, very important point that you mentioned. Equality, it's thrown around all the time.
Yeah.
Now, we know what the founders meant by equality. Equality of justice. Yeah. They didn't mean equality of economics. Of course, that would be absurd, because it's an impossibility. And human beings, we pride ourselves on unique. Human beings are unique individuals. Human beings are created by God. Human beings are one different from the other. But in the civil society, we argue that the law is the law, and everybody should be treated as best as we can, equally in front of a court, in front of the law. But this notion of radical egalitarianism really is a European import.
Yeah. Marx,
Engels, Hegel, Rousseau, which is completely alien to our founders, isn't it?
It is, and it has some precedence in the ancient world. Aristotle, who was a critic of this, said, once a man feels he's equal in one aspect, politics, he assumes he can be equal in every other aspect. Plato said the trajectory is that finally the donkeys and the dogs in Athens have to vote, meaning there will be a destruction of criterion. But you're right, it takes up speed in the Enlightenment in Europe, and it bifurcates. And we thought we were saved from it because the Anglo-Scottish tradition was more limited government, very deep skepticism of the cycles of the French Revolution. And the European continental model is a model that progressives choose. And they have a view that human nature is by nature, a Rousseauian view that we're born into chains, that the church, the community, the family, and it's the duty of government to take off those chains and let everybody be liberated, and then they'll naturally be happy, which is sort of our collective nightmare. But we're headed to a radical egalitarian society in aspects that transcend politics, almost every imaginable facet. And I just meant sports, culture, entertainment, movies. That's the message.
And they advance this notion, tell me if I'm right or wrong, of populism.
Yeah.
When in fact it's authoritarianism.
Yeah.
People believe that they've democratized some program, some issue, some aspect of society, when in fact it's not democratized at all. In fact, it is decisions from on high. The intellectual elites, which they're not really intellectual elites, but they like to think they are intellectual elites. And who are these intellectual elites? Why are they elites? Because they're elected? Because they're members of unions? Because they're in the civil service? I've never understood who these intellectual elites are and why they're so elite.
Well, they have a certain cachet. They think they went to a particular, they're branded like a cattle. They think that the Ivy League brand allows them certain entree or certain privileges. But you look at Silicon Valley, you have gatekeepers that decide what is hate speech or what is not. And they control the expressions of 7 billion people on the planet because they are better, morally better than we are. You turn on public TV and you get this, or cable TV, and you get this anguish about, these people, or the deplorables, the irredeemables, the clingers. I think there was they used the term East Germans. I've heard that said. I think John McCain called them wacko birds and those people. So there was a real contempt for people they feel that don't properly know how to use their freedom and their economic clout, and they do stupid stuff. They buy jet skis, they go snowmobiling, and they pollute the universe. And if you can just have this international global elite that have proper education, proper resumes, proper CVs, sober and judicious, they can all get around and they can say, you know what, we're doing it all for you. And of course, throughout history, we've seen these people, and they all have one thing in common, that they're all excused, or they're not subject to the ramifications of their own ideology. So.
When we come back, I want to ask you about the ramifications, or your insight into this election that just occurred, and what you think of the result, and why you think we got the result that we did. Ladies and gentlemen, don't forget, almost every weeknight you can watch me on Levin TV by going to crtv.com/Mark, crtv.com/Mark, or call us at 844-LEVIN-TV, 844-LEVIN-TV. Hello, America. I'm Mark Levin. This is Life, Liberty, and Levin. We have a great guest, Speaker Newt Gingrich.
Good to be with
How
you.
are you, sir?
Good.
It's a pleasure. Whole hour.
Yeah,
How often do you get that?
not very.
Well, I don't need to introduce you. Everybody knows who you are. But I want to talk first, before we get into the election, because I think it's a crucial election. There are certain issues I want to talk about, certain candidates I want to talk about, the media and so forth. But before we do, I think a little background is useful. You're a historian, and Donald Trump, I would argue, is one of the most conservative presidents we've had in modern history. Now, he may not be a conservative, based on philosophy, but I think he's a conservative as a result of common sense and his background as a developer and so forth. But also, it's part of a trajectory. Explain this trajectory over the last several decades of conservatism and conservative victories.
Well, what had happened was that the Roosevelt-era Democrats created the modern system, big bureaucracies, centralized power, a whole set of values, compounded by Eisenhower making a huge mistake in appointing Earl Warren and leading to a much more radical court than anybody had imagined. So by the early 1960s, you had a reaction building in the country that said government's too big, our policy against the Soviet Union is too weak, taxes are too high, and frankly, we don't want Washington running our lives. The guy who personified that was Barry Goldwater, and he wrote a little book called Conscience of a Conservative, which came out in paperback. And I was a college student at the time, and it just swept the country. I mean, it really created a whole generation of Goldwater supporters who really saw him sort of personifying a new way of thinking about things. He was very important because he broke the establishment's grip on the Republican Party. He lost badly in the general election to Johnson, who probably was going to win anyway because John F. Kennedy had been assassinated and we weren't going to change presidents twice that quickly. But Goldwater sort of planted the flag, and ironically, in defeat, he asked Ronald Reagan to make a nationwide speech in October of '64. And so, in a way, the conservative flag was passed from Barry to Ronnie at that moment. Reagan's speech was electrifying, and he went on to become governor of California. And I would argue that there's a continuum that starts with Goldwater, goes to Reagan, that in many ways Nixon and all the traditional Republicans are placeholders. Just as later on the Bushes would be placeholders because they don't actually understand the long-term trajectory of conservatism. Reagan comes along, ultimately becomes a very consequential president in three ways. Defeating the Soviet Empire, which is an enormous achievement, one of the great strategic victories of all time because he did it without a war. Relaunching the American economy, getting people to feel good about being entrepreneurs, and really focused on American civic culture. And in fact, in his farewell address, he says one of his great sadnesses was that they had not driven home American history enough. But he was trying to rebuild the sense of being American. You then have a period that we're in the doldrums, and we come along with the contract with America. And for the first time in 40 years, the Republicans win the House. We impose a balanced budget for 4 straight years. We impose welfare reform. We have a number of other reforms. Bill Clinton actually comes to the Congress and with a straight face says, the era of big government is over. I mean, it was really a pretty remarkable moment. And led scars on the left, which Hillary never overcame. I mean, there are a lot of liberals who hated what the Clintons did. And then we again sort of had a period of being in the doldrums and following some policies that frankly didn't work. I mean, look, I was for the war in Iraq, and I certainly was for the war in Afghanistan. But you have to look 17 years later and say, we haven't figured out how to win these things. And along comes Trump, and I agree with you about describing Trump. And as you and I talked about earlier off camera, you have the Tea Party movement begin to explode around 2010 because they couldn't grow up against a Republican president, but they could rapidly mobilize against a Democratic president. And so you have a whole new wave of energy. John Boehner and the House Republicans actually won 10 more seats in 2010 than I won in 1994.
63 seats?
63 seats.
You got 54 seats.
Yeah. And Boehner did it with a very straightforward, simple campaign. Where are the jobs? And it just worked. I mean, it came together. People looked up and said, that's the right thing. That's the right question. And so we were back in charge of the House again. And I think people today have no idea how unusual this is. That we held the House for two two-year terms between 1930 and 1994. So out of 64 years, we held the House for 4 years. We've now held the House the vast majority of the time since 1994. And along comes Trump, and I agree with you. I tell people, I'm not sure he's a conservative, but he's the most effective anti-liberal in my lifetime. And whether it's deregulation or conservative judges or cutting taxes or standing up for an American foreign policy based on American values, every time you turn around, he is instinctively saying things which drive the left crazy. And he's doing it, I think, because of this notion of common sense and the things he learned a long time ago. Again, he's old enough. He remembers the values of the post-World War II, highly patriotic America, where people, loved the flag and they loved the idea that we were the greatest nation on earth, and they loved the values of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. And so in a lot of ways, he's carrying forward, almost as a grandfather, the values of 2 generations ago and taking head on the left-wing radical values which the academic world, the news media, and Hollywood have tried to impose on the country.
And yet it seems to me, Newt, that he wasn't always this way. It wasn't always coming toward a conservative conclusion. He had a background as a Democrat, as a Reform Party supporter. He backed some liberals. And I think, as he's been president, that these things have crystallized for him. That sitting there, where the buck stops there, and seeing these policies, seeing the impact of these policies or potential impact of the left's policies, using his common sense and using his business background and so forth, and he's an incredibly intelligent man, and he's sitting there and saying, no, that's not right. And when you really think these things through, he comes, and many people come, to a more conservative perspective.
I think that's partly true, but I think the Donald Trump between 1983 or 4 and as early as the 80s, Oprah Winfrey's asking him if he's going to run for president. He's a very young guy at that point. That Donald Trump, I think, was stunningly shallow and was sort of for whatever we're for, because, that's what we're doing. And gradually began to change. And I think that it is watching Obama that drove him to the right. Because it was just clear, in a sense, Bush and the failure to win in Iraq and Afghanistan drove him into a harsh critique of American foreign policy. And Obama's entire approach to policy drove Trump to just say, this is crazy. I remember years ago I had the opportunity to spend time with the founder of Singapore, who had been the great leader who created a remarkably successful country. And I asked him, what was the base of what he did? And he said, I was a graduate student in Britain during the Labour government right after World War II. And every time I would encounter a problem, I'd ask myself, what would Clement Attlee and the socialists do? And I would do the exact opposite. And it worked every time. And I think, in a sense, Trump came out of the Obama years having been driven to a much more practical businessman, common sense approach. And because he wanted to run as a Republican, he began to acquire allies like Dave Bossie and others who were naturally in the conservative movement. Sean Hannity was probably in some ways, ironically, his closest advisor in that period. You can't do the Hannity show once or twice a week and not gradually become a conservative, because it just doesn't work. And then I remember Clista and I were in the meeting here in Washington, his first visit to Washington as a candidate, where we're sitting around and people, your point, people kind of going, is this guy a total opportunist? Why would I believe him? And somebody in the group came up and said, why don't we put together a list of 10 solid conservatives that you would name to the Supreme Court, so that people can realize here's stability, here's a clear commitment, it's a yes or no. And Leonard Leo and Jim DeMint of the Heritage Foundation agreed to take the lead, and Leonard Leo, who's the head of the Federalist Society. And that's one of the big changes, I think, because we now have relationships that we didn't have 30 years ago. You couldn't have produced the number of judges for Reagan that they're now producing for Trump.
And this came, by the way, out of the Reagan administration. Sort of the farm team became the team. Federalist Society, the Heritage Foundation. Many of the people who are being pointed to the bench worked at the Justice Department, or worked in the U.S. Attorney's offices under Reagan, under Meese, and they developed this whole farm team.
That's exactly right. Yeah. And so Trump, because he was running as a Republican, and because he has no hostility to conservatism, it's just he doesn't think about it much. And he has enormous hostility to political correctness and liberalism because it just doesn't fit how he thinks the world works. And so I think we ended up with somebody who I compare, frankly, to Andrew Jackson as one of the most disruptive presidents we've ever had because he's not afraid to take on the establishment every single morning.
And we need a disruptive president, don't we?
Absolutely. It would have been, I think, if we had had a Reaganite follow Reagan in '88, we might have been, in fact, gotten to where we are today a generation earlier. But it was very hard to break out of the establishment. That's why you have the Never Trump movement, because these are people who are just paralyzed at the idea that their little world is disintegrating and that this brand new populist conservative world is overwhelming them.
And because he is a disruptor, in a positive sense, the people who don't like being disrupted, you talk about the Never Trumpers, are really the Trump haters.
Right.
Not just within the Republican Party, the entire Democrat establishment, including the media establishment, including academia. Almost to a man and woman, they are lined up, attacking this president because he's a disruptor, correct?
Yeah, and I actually think there's a profound historic reason for that. I think at 8 o'clock on election night, all of those people had a bottle of champagne chilling. They were all going to celebrate breaking the glass ceiling with Hillary. They were going to get radicals appointed to the Supreme Court. And life was good. 2 hours later, it's clear that Hillary's going to lose. And if Hillary's going to lose, that means, oh my God, Donald J. Trump's going to be president. So this 2 hours is the equivalent psychologically of an IED going off. And they get basically the equivalent of PTSD. I mean, these people are all in a state of shock. They try to recover, and this is part of Trump's genius. Every morning they wake up and they think this could be a better day, and then he's already tweeted 6 times before they get awake, and they go, oh my God, he's still president, and they go right back into the PTSD. And so what you've had is a collective psychotic experience by the entire left. We would then get together in sort of therapy support groups called fundraisers and cocktail parties and what have you, and they all talk to each other, and they get hysterical. And so, I mean, Max Boot, who's a good historian, wrote at one point he'd rather vote for Joseph Stalin than for Donald Trump. Now, that is an insane comment. I mean, Stalin killed well over 30 million people, but it was just that sense of the mood and, trying to express how deeply he felt.
When we come back, I'm going to ask you what all of this has to do with the upcoming midterm elections and how you compare this to other midterm elections. Is it as important and consequential as so many people have said, or is it just another election? Ladies and gentlemen, don't forget to watch us on Levin TV almost every weeknight. Just sign up at crtv.com/mark, crtv.com/mark, or give us a call, 844-LEVIN-TV, 844-LEVIN-TV. Hello, America. I'm Mark Levin, and this is Life, Liberty, and Levin, and it's an honor to have Dr. David Berlinski with us. How are you, sir?
I'm just fine. Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you for coming all the way from Paris to our little place.
It was endless.
It was endless. Okay. Imagine 100 years ago. Now, that was endless.
It was worse. My trip was
worse. David Berlinski, I want to talk today with you, and you're uniquely qualified to do this, about evolution, science, and progressivism, because there's a link through them all. And you've written about this and spoken about this many, many times. You received your PhD in philosophy from Princeton University, later a postdoctoral fellow in mathematics and molecular biology at Columbia University. I'm glad I didn't take any of those courses. Senior fellow in the Discovery Institute Center for Science and Culture. You've taught philosophy, mathematics, English at Stanford, Rutgers, City University of New York, and in Paris. And you're now the editor of Inference, International Review of Science. Well, let's get started. You wrote a book about a decade ago that I read about a decade ago. And in doing this program, I started to think about it, and I said, I think it's important that we have this discussion about science, evolution, progressivism, and I want to start where you started. Let me read you one paragraph. I'm a secular Jew, you write. My religious education did not take. I can barely remember a word of Hebrew. I cannot pray. I have spent more years than I care to remember in studying mathematics and writing about the sciences. Yet, as you wrote in the preface of this book, the book that follows is in some sense a defense of religious thought and sentiment. Biblical verses are the least of it. A defense is needed because none has been forthcoming. The discussion has been ceded to men who regard religious belief with frivolous contempt. Their books have in recent years poured from every press, and although differing widely in their style, they're identical in their message, because scientific theories are true, religious beliefs must be false. From your book, The Devil's Delusion, Atheism and Its Scientific Pretensions. And that is the thesis. That is the foundational point of your book. Can you expand on that?
Well, something particular and peculiar seems to have come over American intellectual life, Anglo-American intellectual life, perhaps 20 years ago. In the 1950s and 1960s, the position that was academically tolerated was a kind of cheerful agnosticism with respect to the religious tradition of mankind. Could be with respect to God's existence, maybe, maybe not. But this isn't an issue that vexes us profoundly as members of the scientific community at all changed. Now a kind of very, very vociferous and dogmatic atheism has become obligatory in the scientific community. There are exceptions. There are always going to be exceptions. For all I know, some distinguished physicist may be plotting jihad. I have no idea. But by and large, atheism has replaced any kind of tolerant and forbearing agnosticism as the de facto standard in Anglo-American scientific intellectual life. Mm-hmm. And as a result, the religious tradition, that is a very, very long 5,000-year-old tradition, has been made into an object of faint derision among sophisticated men and women, much to the consternation of people who deeply, deeply admire that tradition. And that, I think, is a change in the diapason of life that we need to pay attention to. It's relatively new. I think it started around 1980, 1985. But it has become an accelerating force in intellectual life. If you are minded to be a serious Christian, or an extremely devout and Orthodox Jew, or even a serious Muslim, better not go into the scientific community and tell your fraternity brothers that that is what you are. Best to keep your mouth closed. Mm-hmm. And I think that's generally true. It's among the various topics about which it is not a particularly good idea to make broadcast your views.
And then you add, following up on your point, no scientific theory touches on the mysteries that the religious tradition addresses. A man asking why his days are short is not disposed to turn to algebraic quantum field theory for the answer. The answers that prominent scientific figures have offered are remarkable in their shallowness. They hypothesize that we are nothing more than cosmic accidents have been widely accepted by the scientific community. And you say, basically, science has nothing to say about life and love and death and meaning.
Hardly a controversial point, is it? I mean, if I am asking certain kinds of questions, look around you. There's something there. Open your eyes. You're struck by the existence of the universe. Why is that there? You look at the answers forthcoming from the physics community, they can be described in one of two ways. Well, what do you expect? We're here, therefore there's something there. Or it's kind of an accident. These are not the kind of answers intelligent men and women are searching for. They correspond to no deep intellectual need. They're frivolous. Physics really has nothing to tell us, for example, about the origins and appearance of the universe. It has a lot of interesting things to say about cosmology, but it's not the same question. The most radical question you can ask is, why is there something, anything, rather than what? Nothing. Well, why is there? It's perfectly possible to propose that there could have been nothing whatsoever. I don't mean some pre-existing stuff, I mean nothing. Well, that's not the world we live in. How come? It's a good question. What's your answer? And when you actually look at the physicist, or the biologist, or the chemist, their answer is, we know how it happened. We open our eyes too. There's something. And we can explain the origin of all that by appealing to some pre-existing something. Are you satisfied with that? If not, well, you're not scientifically literate. Lawrence Krauss makes exactly that same argument. Well, the reason the universe popped into existence was a pre-existing quantum field from which it arose by a probabilistic
And they have
measure.
no real solid idea, do they?
None whatsoever.
And yet, they continue to push their theories out as if it's science.
Well, let's be fair. Wouldn't you do the same thing if you were a leading physicist? I sure would. If I had a theory that deep down I knew was no good, but there were all sorts of emoluments, richness, awards, prestige associated with, I would push it for all it's worth too.
Is this why we get these arguments about climate change where the same scientists can't tell you?
I'm talking about the top physicists. Climate change,
okay.
we've got to go down that ladder
Is
all
that right?
the way into the bottom.
And yet, for a lot of us, it's just a mush out there. In other words, you're saying the top physicists, and what I'm saying is, when we take a look at climate change, we have a community that can't tell us the temperature in a week within 10 degrees, but they can tell us the temperature in 100 years within a 1 degree. And what I'm saying is, you're saying these top physicists, but isn't it pervasive? Isn't this a pervasive problem throughout science?
To a certain extent. Look, science is an enormous enterprise. How many guys, how many women, men and women, affirm themselves as scientists worldwide today? Do you happen to have the number? It's 7 million. 7 million people are engaged in the scientific enterprise. And of course, you're going to find very repetitive sociological patterns when there is something as important as the environment or climate. You're going to find groups forming, factions splitting off from the initial group, a tremendous amount of propaganda, elaborate approaches to government resources. There's a great deal of money to be had, and it's not coming from the private sector, it's coming from the federal government. When I talk about fundamental questions about the origin of the universe, we're appealing to the very top of the intellectual ladder. When I talk about climate change, we're talking about some competent people, not many, some competent people with moderately conflicting views, both about the origins of climate change. Yes, the world is getting warmer. The nature of climate change, the reliability of the climatic models, the theories that go into them, and prognostications for the future. It's not entirely clear exactly which group has the most overwhelming and persuasive evidence.
Well, let's talk about the top, if you think this fellow, at least arguably, Darwin. A lot of theories, a lot of arguments, a lot of science, so to speak. What is Darwinianism? What is that?
Well, Darwin comes a mid-19th century figure. 1859, he published what is arguably his masterpiece, The Origin of Species. And the question that Darwin asked himself was a question that all of the 19th century biologists were asking. What is the nature of life? What is the origin of individual species? How did life emerge from inorganic matter? And what are the dynamic laws that change one species into another, if there is such a thing as a change of species? Don't forget, alchemy promoted a very similar thesis when it said base metals could be transmuted into gold. It was an argument for transmutation of elements. Well, Darwin provided an alchemical explanation for biology. Species could be transformed into other species. Well, how could this come about? We don't see it every day. It comes about because there are small variations within each species, and these variations are seized upon by the mechanism of natural selection, which simply means some survive, some don't survive. Over vast periods of time, these small variations accumulate. They converge on a different structure, and various different structures in turn converge on a new body plan, a new organism, a new species, a new entry in the vast pharmacopoeia of life. That's Darwinism. And it's a position which is being increasingly held as a secular doctrine, comparable to the book of Genesis.
Was he right?
I have a lot of doubts. I have a lot of doubts, and so do other people. There are many places when one looks at Darwinism, when one says, hey, look, this just isn't a scientific theory. It's a collection of anecdotes. Why did the giraffe develop such a long neck? Well, he wanted to reach the trees on the top. Well, how come other animals didn't develop the long neck? Well, they didn't want to reach the trees on the top. How come certain kinds of European eels have to swim across the Atlantic in order to mate? Other kinds of eels are perfectly happy fornicating close to home. Well, it worked for one seal, didn't work for the other. Why aren't women born with tails like cats? Well, women don't seem to need the tails, even though it would make them even more alluring than they are. Why don't cats rule the world, considering they have every reason and every opportunity to do so? Well, they're content being our domestic masters. I mean, the anecdotes pile on interminably, and there's no fundamental leading principle.
Do you find that most atheists, more prominent atheists, embrace Darwinism?
Every last one.
And why do they do that?
Because it's a secular myth. Even atheists need some compelling myth, how we got here, what we're doing here, what our purpose is. How we got here, it was an accident. What are we doing here? We have no idea. What is our purpose? It's replication, fornication and replication. That's about it. But it's a very, very viable myth. People believe it. They act according to it.
And it also doesn't tolerate much, as you're right, and as people experience, it doesn't tolerate much religion or people of faith. Hello, America. I'm Mark Levin. This is Life, Liberty, and Levin. Welcome.
Nice to see you.
It's a great honor to see you. Patrick Michaels, doctor, expert on all things climate and environment as far as I'm concerned. A little bit of your background. You're the director of the Center for Study of Science at the Cato Institute. You hold an A, B, and SM. You hold those degrees in biology, sciences, and plant ecology from the University of Chicago. Pretty good school. PhD in ecological climatology from the University of Wisconsin at Madison, 1979. You're past president of the American Association of State Climatologists. You were program chairman for the Committee on Applied Climatology of the American Meteorological Society. Say that fast 5 times.
Yeah.
You were a research professor of environmental sciences at the University of Virginia for 30 years, and I'm giving an extensive, background that you have. I'm giving that to the public so they know you really know what you're talking about. And you're a contributing author and a reviewer of the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 2007. All right, let's get started. Climate change, global warming, global cooling, we've heard it all. What's going on out there?
Well, the surface temperature of the planet is warmer than it was 100 years ago, about 0.9 of a degree Celsius.
0.9 of a degree Celsius.
That's all.
Is that a lot?
No, it's not a lot. There are 2 periods of warming, one in the early 20th century that could not have been caused by human beings because we hadn't put enough CO2 in the air, and one in the later part of the 20th century that either slows down or ends, depending upon whose data you use, somewhere in the late 1990s, only to resume with the big El Nino that covered the news over the last couple of years. So that means that probably about half, maybe half, of that 0.9 of a degree might be caused by greenhouse gases. Because when the planet warmed beginning in 1976, the temperature of the stratosphere started to drop. And that's a prediction of greenhouse theory that's not intuitive. You know, the great philosopher of science, Karl Popper, said, if you can meet a difficult prediction with your theory, you can continue to entertain your theory. So the theory's right, but the application of it is wrong. It is nowhere near as warm as it's supposed to be. The computer models are making systematic, dramatic errors over the entire tropics, which is 40% of the Earth, and it's where all our moisture comes from, or almost all of it.
Let me stop you there.
Yeah.
Who does these computer models?
Governments. There are 32 families of computer models that are used by the United Nations, each government-sponsored, and all of them are predicting far, far too much warming. The disparity between what's been predicted to happen, which looks like this, and what is happening continues to grow.
We know that for a fact.
Yeah, because you can just look at the weather balloon temperatures, you can look at the satellite temperatures, you can look at something called the reanalysis data. They all behave in concert. So they're showing the same thing, and the same thing is a lot different than this thing. However, we need to call the special counsel.
Special counsel?
Yes, because one model works. And you know what it is? It's the Russian model.
So let me get this. So all the government models are like this?
Yeah.
The Russian model is like this?
Yeah. The Russian model has the least warming in it.
And the Russian model is the least warming, and the Russian model pretty much follows reality.
Yeah.
What's been tested over a few decades.
Yeah, correct. You know, if we were rational about this, think about the daily weather forecast. You know, you watch the Weather Channel, they go, oh, this model says that, that model says that. We think this one's working the best, so we're going to rely on that. Well, for climate forecast, we should be using the Russian model, but we're not. We use this big spate of all the other models that have this warming in them that's not occurring.
Why are all these other government models, 31 of them, I guess,
Yeah.
wrong? And why do they all go in the same direction? Up.
Because they are what is called parameterized. They're all parameterized. Can I translate parameterized into English? Fudged.
Okay.
The don't get the right answer, don't know the right answer for certain phenomena. So we essentially put in code steps that give us what we think it should be. And the systematic error that was made was the models were tuned, as it said, tuned to simulate the warming of the early 20th century. Began in 1910, ended in 1945, about 0.45 degrees Celsius. Mark, that could not have been caused by carbon dioxide.
Because there wasn't enough.
We had to put enough in. The background carbon dioxide concentration is 280 parts per million. When the first warming started, it was 298 parts per million. If the atmosphere is that sensitive to an 18 ppm change in CO2, we wouldn't be talking about this right now, and we'd be sweating bullets.
So what you're saying is man-made carbon dioxide earlier, the last century, could not have produced.
The early 20th century.
Early 20th century could not have produced this heat. So what did? Do we know?
No. And, you know, the three most important words in life may not be I love you. It might be I don't know. I don't think anybody really knows what kicked off that warming. There's lots of theories. One is that it was the final escape from a cold period, multi-century period known as the Little Ice Age. That's a plausibility, but why did it happen then? But we just don't really have a good explanation for that. But because we forced the computer models to say, aha, human influence, CO2 and other stuff, we made the models too sensitive. And so that's why when you get to the late 20th century, all of a sudden they're warming up like crazy, and the reality's down here. It was guaranteed to happen. This was revealed in Science magazine in late 2016, and there was a paper that was published by a French climate modeler called The Art and Science of Climate Model Tuning. And in it, he speaks of parameterizing, we could say fudging, the models to give his words an anticipated acceptable range of results. So it's the scientist, not the science, that's determining how much it's going to warm. A lot of people don't know this, but it happens to be true. And, you know, we could speculate as to why that paper was published right before the 2016 election. I wouldn't want to impute causation, but gee, if...
But I want to ask you about causation.
Sure.
You have 31 governments.
No, the 31 different models. Some of them.
All right, 31 different models,
Yeah.
the multiple governments.
Right.
We're fudging the numbers.
They're not fudging them.
They're fudging the models.
Parameterizing.
Okay, well, you use the word fudging. Does our EPA do that? Does NASA do that? Who does that for us?
Aha. Good question, Mark. Because the EPA was told by the Supreme Court in 2007 that if it found that carbon dioxide endangered human health and welfare, that it had the power to regulate it under the Clean Air Act.
This is the Massachusetts
That's
case.
massive EPA. Well, they produced an endangerment finding, 2009. And the endangerment finding for its prospective climate is 100%. I didn't say 90%. I said 100% based on those models. So if you can demonstrate that those models systematically are not working, you can take down the endangerment finding. And that would be the basis for all those policies that came out of the Obama administration.
Which would mean you don't get to regulate
Absolutely.
carbon dioxide.
Absolutely. The endangerment finding is the heart of the matter. And to give you an idea how gung-ho the Obama administration was on this issue, if you listen to his first inaugural speech, January 20th, 2009, it's the second substantive paragraph of the speech is about global warming after health care. 90 days after he finished that speech, his EPA produced a preliminary finding of endangerment from carbon dioxide. They were working on this before he was president. Bureaucrats can't work that fast. And then the final finding was made in December for the climate conference in Copenhagen that was supposed to produce another global warming
So you're
agreement.
telling us that we have a massive bit of public policy that has an enormous effect on society.
Absolutely.
That's built on, I'll use my word, phony models.
It's built on a house of cards. The models really don't work. And if I could really be arcane, I can explain the mechanism as to why they don't work.
As long as I understand it.
The models systematically predict that as you go up in the atmosphere in the tropics, which are 40% of the Earth, that the temperature should rise dramatically as you go further up in the atmosphere. So when you get to the level of the jet stream, the computer models are predicting 7 times. I didn't say 7/10 of a degree. I said 7 times more warming than is being observed. Well, why is that important? Why am I boring you with that? Because it's the vertical distribution of temperature that determines upward motion, which means it determines precipitation. And guess what? Almost all the atmospheric moisture that we have around us today in humid Washington, D.C., that comes from the tropics. So if you get that vertical motion wrong down there, you get all the subsequent variables wrong. It's a fantastic systematic error. And again, that along with the difference between the surface temperatures, or rather the lower atmospheric temperatures and what's being observed, that's sufficient to kill the endangerment finding.
Okay, so to the average pedestrian like me, if you get that wrong, what does that mean? You get all the weather models wrong?
You get the subsequent weather wrong.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's why, if you look at all these families of models, they predict radically different changes in precipitation from model to model. Well, probably because they got the precipitation initialization out of the tropics wrong. Precipitation's important. I offer you Wilmington, North Carolina as an example. The precipitation is important coming from the tropics. Get that wrong, and you get that wrong.
Is weather getting worse?
No. I love that question because what do you really want to look at? Roger Pilkey Jr. at University of Colorado does this. Yes, there's more damage from weather because there's more stuff and people and property in the way of weather. So what you really want to look at are weather damages as a percent of GDP. And when you look at it that way, there's nothing whatsoever. I'm sure hurricanes are getting worse. I heard that on every legacy network during Florence and Harvey and all that stuff. Well, the fact of the matter is, there's a guy by the name of Ryan Maui who's just a hotshot young tropical meteorologist. He's also an adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute, and he tracks the energy in these tropical cyclones since we got global records that begin in 1970. And you would think there would be some relationship between that integrated energy and global warming. After all, it's only logical. Vice President Gore says that must be the case. It's not. There's no relationship whatsoever between the accumulated cyclone energy and the surface temperature of the Earth. It's just not there. Now, wait a minute. Why does our government say this? They said it in their last report called Global Climate Change Impacts in the United States. They said, oh, there's been a significant increase in hurricane power in the Atlantic Ocean from like 1970 to 2009 or something like that, 1980 to 2009. Well, wait a minute. Why'd you stop in 2009? It's a 2014 report. Because if you take the data after 2009, the increase goes away and it goes back to where it was. Or why did you start in the mid-1970s? Because we have records that are really good back to 1920. And if you look 1920 to 1950, you see an increase that is exactly the same as the one that occurred.
So the information they're providing us
is
skewed. Incomplete. It's skewed.
It's skewed. They're cherry picking.
And here we rely on the climatologists, the meteorologists, and they become hyper-political. And I want to get back to that as soon as we return. Don't forget, ladies and gentlemen, you can watch Levin TV almost every weeknight by going to crtv.com/Mark, crtv.com/Mark, and sign up there, or give us a call at 844-LEVIN-TV, 844-LEVIN-TV.